Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development and Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. So, guys, I'm excited to share this episode today and chat a little bit about something Cindy and I've recently got to do. Now, if you hear dogs barking, it's because they are. Maybe you don't. Maybe the microphone's that good. But the reality is, Cindy and I have 3 rescue dogs. 1 we've had for a number of years. 2 we haven't had very long. And the old girl don't like the new ones. And they're fussing at one another, even though they're encaged. And Cindy's not here today. She's with her granddaughter, so she can't hit them. I'm just kidding. We're not going to hit the dogs. But she can't even scold them at this point because she's not here. But we recently had the opportunity to do something unlike we've ever done before. So since 2015, we started our business early on. And one of the first things we did was we hosted an event. We called it Live to Lead Harrisonburg because we bought a license for some content from John Maxwell and that organization, as we've worked so closely with them over the years. And I just found something out right before I started this recording that I'm not going to share with you here, but it's a pretty cool surprise. Well, maybe I will later on, but it's a pretty cool surprise tied to the values advantage that I'm going to talk about. But we started that in 2015. We bought licensing for some content from John Maxwell, where he and other world-class leaders spoke, and I could share it on screen. And we did that Live to Lead Harrisonburg event for 10 years. We did it through 2024. And then in June 2025, just a few months ago, we hosted the first ever leadership legacy experience where we did all in person. We had executive panels. We had CEO of Maxwell Leadership and the owner too, Mark Cole, who travels the world with John, who does so many remarkable things that most people don't get to interact with Mark as routinely, or they're not as familiar with Mark as they are with John, but he is world-class, just a phenomenal person. He was here in person. He did a lunch VIP breakout session. He did our wrap-up closing keynote for the event. And we had several hundred leaders from all over the East Coast in this event. And we're going to grow it for 2026. And I might touch on that as we wrap up here. But that was based on my 2025 release book called Leading with Clear Purpose. Now, we decided that the Live to Lead model that we had followed for 10 years, we could move away from that. And what we did just this past Friday on October 17th, we used the same venue, Blue Ridge Community College, that we've used since 2015 to host the first ever Executive Summit event. Now, that event, we initially were looking at 100 to 125 participants, and praise God, we only had 60 because we put so much into making sure that all the mid-level managers to executives to business owners that participated in that event had tremendous interaction and networking with their peers, not just hearing from me and Cindy. And I'll come back to what all that looked like in just a minute. But we put a tremendous amount of effort, time, and energy into making sure that interaction was fluid throughout the day. And I'm glad it was only 60 or so folks involved from about 30 organizations, because it was hard. It took a lot of prep time. It took a lot of intentionality to make sure that they had that interaction. And the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. So we're just super excited about moving that model into a bigger and better format in years to come. What that looked like was we really focused around a common theme, and that was applying the values advantage. I've got a new book coming out in February of 2026 that's called The Values Advantage. And we'll be launching some things moving forward around a framework for really applying that values advantage into organizations, into every organization, because it's just as important for an organization that's made up of me and Cindy as it is for a global organization with tens of thousands of people to have those clear, specified, and articulately defined values in place. Now, what we provided throughout the day, this was basically a full day event that we hosted for these 60 or so leaders from about 30 different organizations. And we had folks from other states too. We had North Carolina and Tennessee, and I think West Virginia and Maryland represented in the crowd on last Friday. But as we did that, we presented 3 different lessons, which come from the values advantage. And I'll share how you can kick the tires, so to speak, how you can get some early access to that if you want before we wrap this up. So one of those lessons, the first one, was called Laying a Foundation Around Values. And we really looked at the simple practices that each of us as leaders need to make sure that we've got in place for ourselves to be able to exemplify those core values that we want our organization to be based on, statistically speaking. And one of the things I found is, as I was doing the research and the study leading up to writing the Values Advantage, is just about 80% of all organizations list some level of core values in their handbooks, on their website, whatever. But you and I both know that not all those organizations actually live up to or even talk about those values. Gosh, not so long ago, Cindy and I were with an organization, an outstanding organization with some really, really good supervisors, managers, leaders in that organization. And we opened our 2 half-day workshop session by talking about their values. And interestingly enough, I'm going to say the average tenure for those folks was about 20 years. It varied from about 13 on the low end to 30 on the high end, but most of them were in that 18 to 20 year range. And we're asking them to talk about their core values. And for a while, there was an uncomfortable silence, and nobody listed the core values of that organization. And finally, we started to hear, as it got too uncomfortable, some folks started to say, well, maybe quality's one, because they really do put out quality products. And hey, maybe safety's one of our values, because they care. They do a lot of work. They're really intentional about providing a safe work environment for their employees. However, those were not their core values. Their core values were, in fact, listed on the wall in the room that we were in. Just nobody heard them often enough by the leadership team, by the corporate executives, by anyone to understand what those core values were. And more importantly, they didn't understand how they applied to their individual roles. So we did that. We talked about that at length. And then in the very first session, what Cindy and I had the opportunity to dig into was group discussion around several different things. One of the things we looked at was, hey, how have you defined your core values? What challenges are you seeing as an organization in making sure that they're understood and they're applied at all levels of the organization, from the guy taking out the trash to the guy signing the paychecks, how, and everywhere in between. How have you defined those core values in a way that people understand, not just what they say, but what they really mean for them? Then what followed was group discussion, where these executives, nobody from the same companies, were at the same tables. How could they interact with their peers in different industries around how they had done that in their organization? And it was fantastic to watch that interaction as the day went through. The next question that we did for those group discussions in that first round, we talked about, gosh, what specific behaviors do you consistently model for your organization's values, and how do you ensure they're visible for your teams? Because if we're not doing it, we can't expect our team members to understand it, to be able to embrace it, to really embed that into the roles that they've got. The third question that we talked about for them was, how do you resist the temptation to avoid those trendy or complex strategies? Because gosh, there's never a shortage of consultants. There's never a shortage of the new greatest and best thing in the world, the best thing since sliced bread, so to speak. There's never a shortage of those things out there. The reality is, though, in 20 years in manufacturing and all the different before and afters that I've seen, I've rarely seen processes stick unless they're simple enough to be understood immediately and applied simply. Quite frankly, I love behavioral assessments. I love all things like that, but I gravitate back to, over and over and over, the DISC model of human behavior for that one reason, because it's so simple to understand and it's so simple to apply. Even without assessments, we can watch the behaviors in somebody. The same thing has to happen with our values. We need to keep it simple, and we need to make sure that we've articulated it well enough so anybody can grasp it and take hold of it. Now, the fourth question that the first round of discussion really focused on was, what systems or routines have you implemented to build and really sustain those values-driven habits into your daily leadership? And gosh, the interaction that we saw with the folks around those was just phenomenal. We heard people sharing, here's what I've done in my organization, here's some pitfalls we've run into, here's what people have grabbed hold of. And we watched connections across industries, because the common theme that all industries have is we've got people in those industries. We depend on our individual team members to really move the needle forward. And when we can help them have those values, we can put those simple practices in place, we can give them something to connect with. Now, the next session that Cindy and I talked about, we looked at how we can build a culture around those core values in our organization. And that was really themed around the idea of, we as leaders, we've got to provide a remarkably consistent example for them to watch. Now, I started that lesson off by talking about kids. And the reality is, if you've got kids or you've ever even been around a kid at any time in your life, you know that you can tell them to do something. But if they see you doing something different, or they hear you, gosh, don't let profanity slip by any means, because they're going to follow your example, not what you've told them to do. I remember growing up, my dad would jokingly sometimes say, "Do as I say, not as I do." And I get that in practice or in theory, but the reality is people do what people see. They don't do what people are what they're told to do all the time. And that's the idea. And that's the lesson that Cindy and I shared around the idea of being that consistent example for our teams. As we broke out into the discussion groups, this time each individual in the room had a completely new table that they were with, 4 or 5 different folks that they could interact with for the second round of discussion. We talked about what specific actions do they take to demonstrate it, but how are they working through those with the individuals that they are most directly with, but also how do they share that example for everybody else that they interact with, not just on big picture in their own role, but how do they actively work to look at ways they can exemplify those behavioral examples of those core values in every role that they can interact with. If I'm the CEO, how can I make sure that the parking lot attendant understands how it fits in their role? Well, I can do it by, if I'm passing through, how do I exemplify it by helping out with what they're doing, even if it's briefly? I'm not advocating spending all my life in a role that's not mine, but how do I look for those opportunities routinely to be able to exemplify our values as it relates to somebody else's role? The next thing that we dug into in the second round, we talked about, gosh, how do you help your team members understand that implicitly, how those values apply, like I just said, to what they do daily? Sometimes that's us showing them. Sometimes it's us helping talk through it and challenging them to think through what it looks like. And sometimes it's addressing it when their behaviors don't align with the values, when those behaviors don't model those values for the folks that we're interacting with, for the folks that count on us for the service that they're paying us for, right? Now, and that leads us right to the next question that we looked at about consistently reinforcing behavior. And that sometimes recognized behavior gets repeated is something that I learned 25 years ago in behavior-based safety. Sometimes that means we need to recognize the good things people do and connect it back to our values and tell them exactly why that's the right thing. But sometimes that means we also have to specify, hey, what you did right there, that missed the mark. We need you to do better. And here's why. Here's how it didn't help. Here's what it maybe was counterproductive in, but here's how we can tweak that and we get to the right thing. It's not constructive criticism. How do we provide that alliance feedback with the people on our team, because we are indeed going in the same direction? How do we make sure we're tracking? The final session was a fun one. From there, we dug into the idea of creating a legacy through our values. How do we make sure that when we model the values routinely over and over and over, it really becomes what we're known for, both internally, the culture within the organization, but externally, the reputation our organization really lives out in the community. And we walked through, specifically in that discussion, how do we make sure we maintain that clarity? How do we set expectations that are held consistently and they're sustained over time in a way that every single member of our team can tie into those values and they can live them out specific to their own roles? The next part was, gosh, how do we foster high expectations around those to maintain it long term? The reality is our best team members, they want to be held accountable. The lowest performing team members I've ever been around don't want high expectations and they don't want accountability. But I'm going to go so far as to say the best team members look to get away from those low performing team members any way they can. And if we allow that low expectation, that low accountability to permeate our culture, it's going to push our best team members away. And we talked about that within our groups. I think the final question that we talked about in our small groups, in our group discussion afterward, was really around building accountability without condemnation, where we talked about how do you balance coaching and accountability to reinforce values-driven behaviors, and what approaches have you found effective for addressing missteps in the behaviors. And we had a lot of good discussion. Actually, I had a couple conversations with members of different groups around the idea of it's okay to let people know, hey, if you're not willing to meet the expectations or even exceed the expectations we've got in this organization, this might not be the best organization for you. Maybe there's somewhere else that you're a better fit. That's okay. Okay, God bless you. But the reality is we're moving this direction. We're going to exceed expectations. We're going to, at a minimum, meet expectations, or we're going to figure out how we can get there. And if somebody's not willing to tie in with that, then, hey, sometimes it's not the best fit for the individual with that particular organization, and it's only bringing everybody else down in the process. Now, we closed that day with something really fun where we challenged everybody in the room. Now, if you've been with me and Cindy in anything we do, you know we're always saying, hey, what's your one immediate action step? What result do you want to get through that action step? How will you measure it in your bottom line? And how will you see it change your leadership culture? And then we challenge folks to list a couple things that they can put in place to help sustain that change that they're implementing. Because anytime we change a behavior, it's hard. That's why Cindy and I started doing coaching a number of years ago, not because we wanted to coach per se. We wanted to be able to help folks sustain behavioral change because it doesn't just happen on its own. Now, those three additional steps are really meant for that to sustain those behaviors. Now, we wrapped up with the day with challenging everybody right then and there to write down that one thing that they could apply immediately coming out of the event. Hopefully after each of the lessons and each of the discussion questions, they had ideas that they could put in place. But we didn't want to take a chance that they would leave the room without having specificity around exactly what they could do, why they were going to do it, and what result they wanted to achieve. Many of them we have coaching relationships with because they're in our Executive Leadership Elite Think Tank or Impact Leadership Academy, and all of which will be coming up for renewals, and we'll be taking new members on in those in the coming months. So you might see those in the show notes as well. But the reality is, as we did that, we challenged folks to provide us with those steps so we could help them work toward achieving it. One, so they build that better leadership culture, right, around the values that they've got in their organization. But just as importantly, how do they make sure it impacts their bottom line? Because every organization, private, public, nonprofit, whatever, we all have fixed budgets. We all have a responsibility to make an impact on the people we serve. And it all boils down to how do we perform our jobs? How do we lead as effectively as we possibly can? Now, a couple things I'll share as we wrap this up. The Values Advantage is the book that all this is based on. We're going to be working through some things that I'll talk more about later on, but we've worked with a number of folks. I did a podcast episode not so long ago where I talked about the real world examples, final chapter that we're going to be having with that. And we've since scheduled a pre-order special event. We're going to be doing some very, very cool short-term or limited time offers around folks that participate with us there and help us with the pre-order campaign. But on January 18th, we're already taking registrations now. We're going to be doing a live stream event where several of the folks who are in that real world examples chapter and will be on executive summit panel or executive panels as part of the 2026 Leadership Legacy Experience, they'll be on that live stream event with us, and we'll be doing that pre-order. I believe we're going to be able to, again this year, offer for a limited time the pre-order ebook version of the Values Advantage at 99 cents. And it's pretty cool in how that works because you'll have lifetime access to the ebook at 99 cents and so on. And we'll be building out some other things that will really deliver a lot of value around that for you. So I think the last thing I'm going to share with you here is that if you would like to kind of kick the tires and get a feel for some of the stuff that we've covered in the Values Advantage, more specifically the lessons that we shared, at least a glimpse of, not the specific lessons, maybe the initial ones that I shared over in our Leading at the Next Level program. One of the things that we've started offering is a 14-day trial for just $1. You can find that in the show notes or in the comments or wherever you're accessing this, but it's a 14-day trial for just $1. It's a $1 setup fee. But what it sets you up to do is if you choose to continue after that 14 days, it automatically enrolls you in a monthly membership where you'll have 80% off the regular price. So the regular price is $50 a month. We do new lessons monthly in that. We typically do 2 live lessons each month. And almost all of those are brand new for the very first time. And there's now more than 170 hours worth of content over on the digital side. We're building out a new community with that soon. There's a lot of new stuff rolling out with it. As it stands today, every single lesson in that digital resource is approved for continuing education credit through the Society for Human Resource Management, as well as the Human Resource Certification Institute. I don't know of a program in the marketplace today that resembles what we've done with that. And you can have all unlimited access to it for 14 days for $1, and moving forward at 80% off. And I think that takes it to about $9.99 or 97 cents, something like that afterwards. So I hope this serves you well. If you have any other questions from this Leading at the Next Level podcast, or you'd like to learn more about the complete program, you're always welcome to reach out to us at admin@dove-development.net with any questions. And we look forward to see you soon. We've got some pretty cool interviews coming up that really tie in to the values advantage, and also connect back to the idea of how that purpose really matters for following those values. Hope this serves you well. Make it a great day, and God bless.